So next up in our continuing series on wild teas is my personal favorite, Labrador Tea. If you're interested in learning more about Labrador Tea, stay tuned. So again, the reason for this series on wild teas. I believe that looking for plants that you can use to make wild teas is a great introduction to foraging in the woods. These are plants that can be safely identified, enjoyed right away, and have medical benefits. So there are three distinct species of Labrador tea. The northern Labrador tea, sometimes referred to as wild rosemary, bog Labrador tea, which is what I have here, and western Labrador tea. So let's take a closer look at the Labrador tea and see if we can't do some identifying characteristics. But rather than do it here in my backyard, let's go into the woods. Okay, so I'm just slightly off trail, not the patch that I was looking for, but a nice small patch of Labrador tea. And we're going to have a look at this Labrador tea and just do a little bit of a identification on it to help you and to show you a comparison with a plant you do not want to confuse it with. So I have Labrador tea here. Now what we can see on the Labrador tea, and I'll have to bring some close-ups as well, this would have been the flowering body right here at the tip. A few weeks ago there would have been little white flowers all over that, and I think I have some video I may be able to put in here to show some of those white flowers. It has a brown stalk and it is a woody stalked plant, as you can see. Now this is an especially tall one. You don't usually see them this tall. Where do you find them? That's probably one of the first things is to help identify them, is knowing where to find them. They will be all but in water directly. It'll be a bog, without question a bog. You may find them near a boggy lakeshore, but more or less it has to be a full bog. The alkalinity of the water has a lot to do with whether or not they'll support the growth of the Labrador tea. But here is Labrador tea. Now, small green leaves. I'll bring some in closer in a second to show you. When you turn the leaves over, and this is the distinguishing factor, when you turn the leaves over, the underside, first off, the margins of the leaves are rolled a little bit to the underside, but the underside of the Labrador tea will always be fuzzy. Quite a distinctive fuzziness. If it's this year's growth, it'll be white. See if I can find any of last year's growth to compare. Right. There's a better one over here. Right into the water. Okay, this is last year's growth, so it has an orange fuzz underneath of it. But on that same stalk, you can see where this year's flower was, and above the flower, this year's leaves of Labrador tea, the white fuzziness. Now, I'm looking around to see if there's a plant right next to it, and there is. And let's see if I can focus in on this one. All right, when you compare the two of them side by side, you can see distinct differences. Now let me take one of these off. If you're looking at them, you can see the distinct differences between the two plants. The one in this hand is the Labrador tea. The one in this hand is sheep laurel, with just the last of this year's blossoms on it. Sheep laurel is also known as lamb's kill, for a reason. Sheep preferentially, in fields where this grows, sheep will eat this and it will kill them. So this is a poisonous plant to consume. There is a superficial resemblance to them in the elliptical nature of the leaves, but as soon as you turn them over, you can see the difference. The underside of the sheep laurel is whitish, but it's not fuzzy. The edge margins of the leaves do not roll over, and you don't get that same white fuzz you do on the underside of Labrador tea. Alright, so that's the one that's most closely looking in nature. But once you see them side by side, you'll know. Don't try to fool yourself into believing that this is Labrador tea. Be sure of what you get. You don't want to pick sheep laurel thinking it's Labrador tea. Make sure you have Labrador tea. So, this single stalk, well, single bush of Labrador tea, as I said, is unusually big. And you don't usually find them like that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to harvest about 1/4 of what I see in front of me, taking them off individual branches. I'm trying to do a respectful harvest to ensure that this will be here again next year. It's a slow growing plant, and if you take all of it, you won't have any next year. So be conservative in what you take, and when you find a good patch of it, just take one, maybe off of every other plant. All right, I'm going to harvest a little bit more of this, and we'll talk about its medicinal value a little later. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the use of Labrador tea. Our indigenous peoples use Labrador tea for a variety of ailments, and including things like diarrhea, sound familiar, a lot like the sweet fern is, joint pain, so rheumatism, arthritis of different types. It's also been used as a wash for skin rash, bug bites, poison ivy, prepared as a tea, let cool and washed over. Also be used as a cough suppressant. If you have a respiratory condition, maybe a bit of a wheeze after a cold, it can be used for that as well. And those uses are actually still recommended uses for this plant today medicinally. Personally, I just like the flavor. It does have some other interesting historical use as well. Back in the 18th century, it was used before hops were found to be used in beer. 18th century monks used it, but eventually it had to be outlawed because apparently it was causing quite a bit of a violent nature in people because of its hallucinogenic properties, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. A little bit more recently, the Hudson Bay fur traders were sending back large amounts of tea to the UK as a substitute for tea from other parts of the world. A little bit more recently, the American Revolution. This was also, like sweet fern, one of those teas that was used as a substitute for tea when it was being banned from importing. Again, during the Depression, it was also used as a substitute tea. So it does have quite an interesting background. Today, I think it is used primarily by people who like to go into the woods, can recognize it for what it is, and make it just a nice cup of tea while they're there. So one of the things I didn't mention in the video while I was in the woods is that this plant is considered an evergreen, meaning that it will stay green all winter long. I showed how some of the undersides of the leaves have that fuzzy brown, and that's what you'll see in the wintertime. As long as the snow's not too deep, and this can be found poking up out of the snow in the marsh. Actually, it might be easier to find in the wintertime if you don't have too much snow, that is, because the marsh or the bog is likely to be frozen over. Usually at this time of year when I find it, it's pretty much in water and making it a little bit more difficult to get at. But it can be used any time of the year to make a nice cup of tea. What I do with it when I bring it home is I dry the tea out. And how I do that, and there's one or two methods you can use. One is to keep it on the stalks and just tie the ends of the stalks together and hang them upside down somewhere in your house where it is dry, maybe a little bit cool, but away from the sun. And they will, over a matter of a few days, dry out, and then they can be stored in plastic bags or jars or whatever else you want to use them in airtight storage for quite a long period of time. You do want to keep them out of the sun because you don't want the sun to leach out any of its flavor or medicinal value. Alternatively, and this is what I'll do if I have quite a bit of Labrador tea that I'm trying to store up, is I'll use my dehydrator. It just takes less than an hour to dehydrate the tea so that you can store it again. So to prepare Labrador tea, either in the woods or at home with dried Labrador tea, I use about 5-6 leaves, and I'll crush them up or break them up and pull them apart if they're fresh, and I'll put them in a cup of boiling water. Now, I won't boil it. I'll take the water off a boil and let it steep in the hot water for 5 or 10 minutes. If you want to keep it hot, just cover it over and it'll remain hot for at least that long. Be aware, though, that there is such a thing as having too much of a good thing. While this is an enjoyable cup of tea, I wouldn't recommend having too much, such as multiple cups in a row or having it too often. There is a potential toxicity, although the bog Labrador tea, the type we have in this area, has the least amount of the potential toxins in it. The toxicity, although not deadly, or at least there's been no reports of deaths due to this toxicity, can cause a narcotic type of effect. So a slight sedation, maybe that's enjoyable in terms of just relaxing you, but when you start to reach higher levels, it can have an effect on your breathing and definitely on your mental state. It also has hallucinogenic properties, so be reserved in how much Labrador tea you consume. So as with sweet fern, Labrador tea can be mixed with other wild teas to create new flavors. My recommendation is try Labrador tea on its own. If you enjoy that, try mixing it in with some of the other wild teas like sweet fern, or maybe wild mint, or maybe wintergreen. 2 other wild teas we'll talk about in future videos. Okay, If you've enjoyed this video on Labrador Tea and you would like to see more, consider subscribing to my channel. But until next time, get out and explore. Take that path less traveled. It will make all the difference. Bye for now.